Before I get started, so this is the title is an evolving thing. This is actually, I think, my first or second time presenting it ever. So your feedback is more than welcome. It's very much a work in progress, and the title is a moving target. It's we like military Keynesianism as a concept, and so we want to include it in the title. And it's joint work with Ileana Kuzemko and Danny Arnauto, who's a graduate student at Columbia. And before I get started, I just want to say, CORE is awesome, and I've been part of it for a while, to the point that I was at a CEPR conference on monopsony in the labor market, and was sort of using CORE to talk about it to researchers about here's how you can combine monopsony and efficiency wages in one model, and just kind of and we teach it to undergrads. And so you should all, if you're not familiar with it, you should definitely take a look. Okay, this project is really sort of trying to look with fresh eyes at a historical phenomenon that's well known. It's the Great Compression, which is inequality falls rapidly, sort of in the 30s and 40s, and then we get sort of the golden age of capitalism of 30 years of rapid and equitable growth rates. We get GDP growth. We also have converging black racial gaps in the U.S. We have rising intergenerational mobility. We have robust union power. The returns to college degree are quite low relative to high school. So just kind of like that, we hold up that as 30 years. Those are the periods where capitalism delivered, high growth rates and full employment and a reasonable degree of equality. There's many explanations out there. So one Ileana and I have with a previous paper was sort of emphasizing unions, and mid-century unions were a powerful force for equalizing the income distribution. Golden and Margot emphasized the supply and demand of skills and sort of argued that the expansion of schooling in the post-war, and the cohorts entering the labor market in the post-war period is a big explanation of the reduction in inequality. And then Piketty, Size, and Sencheva emphasized the historically high top tax rate. So what we think we're doing is putting a new force on the table here, which is just, even after World War II, the U.S. is spending an enormous share of GDP on defense. And it's both relative to other countries and relative to its own spending before the World War II or since. And this is Cold War policy of high military expenditure, even in peacetime. And so you can look at these national security memos. So National Security Memo 20 is written in 1948. And this line is literally copy and pasted through national security memos, which is we need to develop a level of military readiness which can be maintained as long as necessary as a deterrent to Soviet aggression, as indispensable support to our political attitude towards the USSR. So it's that's the official policy, is to maintain, a large, technological and military capacity so that it acts as a deterrent to the Soviet Union. And particularly, and the composition of this is not going to be constant over time, and that's going to be kind of the variation that we exploit, but especially during active conflicts, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, this production gets concentrated in the low-scale manufacturing sector. So when you're fighting these active wars, you put a lot more money into boots and bombs and tanks that are just kind of much more blue-collar intensive sectors. While then, when those wars kind of end, and then you're sort of worried about, say, nuclear weapons, you then move a lot of money into bombers and ICBMs, and those are going to be different technological shifts in the direction of military procurement that are just going to be enormous sums of money moving across U.S. labor markets, and that's going to be the kind of variation that we're looking at. And then the other sort of part of this paper that we're also looking at is the draft. And so it's, again, that a large share of young workers were drafted into the military. And so that just pulls out of the lowest wage component of the labor market a large share of workers and puts them on bases. Even when they're not fighting a war, they're just kind of hanging around on military bases. And so that just sucks a lot of labor out of the labor market. And so we're going to look at the effects that the draft had on unemployment rates of young workers. And of course, this is much discussed contemporaneously. So Robert McNamara basically gets it that a big chunk of the Department of Defense is a giant Works Progress Administration program, which is kind of a public works program. And this was well understood by, I think, economists even in the 50s and 60s. So Joan Robinson, and this is in a AER presidential address she's giving, an AEA presidential address she's giving, is just, Keynes tried to suggest that, the Keynes opponents said, Keynes just wants you to dig holes in the ground. It's actually worse than that. It's that the UK is beholden to the holes in the ground that the Americans dig, and that those holes in the ground are the military budget. And Keynesian prosperity has been a byproduct of the Cold War. And so just to give you a sense of the magnitude, so this is the defense share of GDP after World War II. So generally we put this on the same graph as World War II, and so the post-World War II stuff gets swamped. But when you even just look at the post-World War II stuff, it's it's upwards of 12% of GDP during the Korean War, and then even after the Korean War it falls, but still stays above 5% of GDP almost all the way through until the end of the Cold War, where it falls to 3 or 2% of GDP. So it's a good, actually interesting thing for an applied micro person, which is that a lot of the sort of things you'd be worried about for identification, when you're looking at magnitudes that are this big, you get a real sort of sense of there's maybe another force going on, but just relative to the quantities of money that are getting moved around by the defense, it's just unlikely to be a competing hypothesis just because of the magnitude we're looking at. And this is the draft. So this is the active duty share of men between 18 and 24 from 1947 onwards. Again, sort of spikes during the Korean War, but then stays high, spikes again during Vietnam, and then sort of comes down. And that's when the draft is eliminated. You probably know the history of how economists in the U.S. were a big part of the movement to sort of end the draft. So the draft ends in the 1970s, and so the active duty share of men sort of falls a lot. So we're going to be looking at this active duty share of men and its effects on the labor market. So in terms of some background, so this concept of military Keynesianism, we didn't make it up. It's so both contemporary historians and economists back in the day highlighted the important role of the Cold War in the U.S. political economy. So either the military Keynesian term or another term used sort of read a lot of the permanent war economy. There's been a recent book by Michael Brennes, and Tim Barker has a forthcoming. These are books by historians sort of talking about the importance of the Cold War spending and sort of maintaining this prosperity. But the idea is there even before the general theory is war is the only legitimate excuse for creating employment by governmental expenditure. It's an old argument. But this is just kind of not in the contemporary sort of quantitative literature on inequality, and so we're trying to put this back in as an important force. And so our contributions are to quantify the Cold War era roles of military procurement on manufacturing employment and inequality, and then the military draft on labor market type. So these are the two things we're going to do. Okay, so what we're going to do is isolate these procurement shifts. So basically, what happens in the mid-1950s is that we get kind of a pivot in U.S. weapons away from the blue-collar stuff and towards the high-tech stuff. And so then what we're going to be looking at is how this post-Korea shift towards missile production, which is dubbed by Eisenhower, it's the new look for the American defense sector. And so we're going to be basically looking for this event, which is the hard pivot away from manufacturing towards aeronautics and aerospace, and that's going to generate geographical variation in exposure to procurement. And so then we're going to look at the effects of this on the manufacturing share of employment, the top 10 income share, the share of population filing federal tax returns, which in this period is a decent proxy for inequality, the share in covered employment. So you can think of covered employment as covering kind of good jobs, which are not domestic work, not agricultural workers, are not covered by the unemployment insurance system. So this is a measure of sort of formal sector employment. We can look at federal income tax revenue and firearms per capita. And just to give you a sense of magnitudes, we can explain about 60% of the decline in Michigan's manufacturing employment per capita and almost 100% of the increase in Arizona. So these are just it's just a lot of money moving around, and so you kind of can get a big effect. As a sort of complement to this, we also have microdata on the individual firms and the procurement that they get from the Department of Defense, and so we merge this to data on CEO pay and firm fundamentals. And so what we sort of show is that when you get this money from the government, yes, your market cap goes up, but your CEO pay doesn't change at all. And it's because there was incredible scrutiny of the defense money. And so it was like not getting turned into CEO pay at the same rates that normal kind of revenue shocks would be turned into CEO pay, because they're calling up they're reporting on the CEO pays to the Department of Defense. There's a lot of transparency requirements. And so we're going to show that the firms that get this, that get procurement kind of have these declines in executive compensation to market cap ratio. Okay, and then that's our first shock. So that's Korea. And then we're going to have another shock, which is Vietnam. So basically, I'm going to skip most of them, but we have 4 different events here, which is like corresponding to different pivots. So it's going to be Korea, Vietnam, Carter and the end of détente, and then the end of the Cold War. Those are going to be our kind of 4 events. But so Vietnam is the next one. So and then the McNamara tries to cut the fat at the Department of Defense, but then Vietnam starts and they have to build up a lot. So and in this period the data gets better, and so we have more detailed state year data. In particular, we can break out R&D from non-R&D spending, and kind of isolate the role of the non-R&D, which is much more of the blue-collar stuff than the R&D spending, and kind of look at those effects differently. And so we can replicate most of the effects from Korea to missiles, but we can also show that it's almost all coming from like the non-R&D spending. And so it's really this kind of basic stuff that's kind of driving the manufacturing employment and the inequality results. And then there's the end of détente in 1979, and then Carter, Reagan rearm. I'm probably going to skip this for time. But what's interesting about this, we get the effects on manufacturing and most of the other outcomes, but not the reduction in inequality. So basically, like in the 1980s, that expansion of the defense sector does not sort of undo the other forces that are causing inequality. But again, like the non-R&D is key for kind of propping up manufacturing employment even through this like 1980s recession. And then our last shock is going to be the end of the Cold War and the peace dividend. And this fall in procurement spending we're going to show is associated with declining manufacturing and rising inequality. And so then to kind of put it all together in one big regression, we're going to combine all these episodes in a standard 2-way fixed effects analysis and just kind of get coefficients for the whole period. And we're going to estimate that the 1950s to 1990s decline of military spending explains like 25 to 35% of the decline in manufacturing employment and 10% of the rise in the top benches. And what's interesting, so a natural question you might have is, well, how much is it really valid to do like a state year comparison? Because it's so big, aren't you like pulling stuff away from other states? And so you're getting this kind of spillovers from other states. So we do a bunch of things to look at this, and it's just interesting kind of this area of research to do. How do you go from this like micro to macro aggregation? But I think the most convincing thing is that when you just kind of run the time series regression of manufacturing employment on share of the GDP in defense, you kind of get a coefficient that's very close to the state year panel regression. So it just suggests that there's like a ceiling on how bad the spillovers have to be, because you're kind of replicating the same analysis in just the aggregate time series regression. Okay, and then if I get to it, we have these results on the draft where it's like the increase in active duty population during the draft era significantly reduced draft age male unemployment rates. So basically the decline in the active duty share of men predicts basically a 2 percentage point increase in their relative unemployment rates, which is kind of the 79% of their actual increase. And what we're really looking for here is annual wage by age data over this like 1950s, 1960s period, particularly 1950s, so we can use the CPS. And so for the 60s on, and we're just kind of like on a hunt for wages, so that we can sort of show that this like tightness measure in the labor market sort of turns into wages. Okay, and then at the absolute end, we're going to kind of bring it back to the political economy of the Cold War and talk about how this procurement doesn't just have labor market and inequality effects; it also changes people's political preferences. And so, basically, prior to World War II, for example, the U.S. was had a very strong isolationist streak, and that's kind of changed slowly by World War II and the years after it. And what we can show, though, is that the state-level procurement, it's a strong predictor for the Korean War, but only after the war. So basically, there's no correlation between the money you're going to get for the Korean War and your support for the war in like 1950, but then in 1953, there's like a lot of support for the war in exactly the states that are getting a lot of money because of the war. There's just kind of this idea that the spending kind of creates its own political constituency. And then what we sort of are in the process of digging into is like who did it, and it's like basically it's the working class bloc of the Democratic Party. So it's like union members, Democratic voters. These are the people that are like the most hawkish on foreign policy in the 1950s period. So the Republicans are still in their like kind of isolationist. There's a big isolationist trait in the Republican Party. It's the Democrats that are kind of the hawkish anti-communist foreign policy people in the 50s. And what's interesting, because we are using this Gallup data that's also kind of it's similarly done in many other countries at the same time, we can show it's only in the U.S. that you have this. In every other like NATO country, that working class bloc is like against hawkish foreign policy. It's only in the U.S. that they're kind of into hawkish foreign policy. So the Cold War not only had these effects on the labor market, it sort of created its own political constituency where you had this like robust working class voting bloc for sustained government. Okay, so if I don't get to the end, that's kind of it. That's in terms of the result. So what are some implications? So the one family of explanations of things that are important, which is like the explanations of manufacturing decline. So people have highlighted trade and automation. It's Otter, not Tutor. Sorry. This paper by Alder et al. Sort of focuses on like labor conflict in unions as a cause of manufacturing decline. That's on kind of the supply side. On the demand side, there's just kind of a usual patterns of structural transformation where just income effects in consumer demand kind of drive the composition of demand towards services and away from manufacturing, and that gets you declining manufacturing share. And we're kind of like saying the government is itself like an input into manufacturing, into slowing at least manufacturing decline. And it's partly that this is also an input into the contemporary debate on industrial policy. So the Trump-Biden tariffs, the Inflation Reduction Act, and particularly the CHIPS Act, they're not like industrial policy just done for the sake of holding up a manufacturing sector. They're done in the context of like renewed geopolitical rivalry with China. And this is not a coincidence, we think, that like, those military and defense kind of imperatives are kind of pushing along the demand for industrial policy. And so we are kind of able to look at these questions in this historical period where, again, like the Department of Defense is obsessed with maintaining supply chains, with sort of making sure there's like this fair industrial capacity, and so that if there's a war that breaks out, we can mobilize lots of resources very quickly. And so the same kind of concerns that are entering into the minds of policymakers around kind of, where the semiconductor is going to come from are entering into the minds of policymakers in the 1960s. And it's this the Cold War we think sort of built this local industrial capacity and created the steady demand for manufacturing workers. But your conclusions about the welfare effects of this might differ. But we should just put it on the table that the Cold War led to like an enormous amount of death in the developing world, 2 to 3 million people are killed in Korea, 1 to 4 million are killed in Vietnam. And these have like very high civilian to combatant ratio relative to the wars the U.S. in. The U.S. is like, a lot of American troops sort of died, but it's very small by the standards of like World War II and World War I. So it's like we wouldn't say and there was never like a direct U.S.-USSR conflict, but really that conflict was played out in developing countries in various ways. And so, this there's probably if you wanted this, there might be a better way of getting it than the Cold War. Okay, what's the data that we use? So we get this procurement data, so we get contract level microdata from 1966 onwards. So this was used in Nakamura and Steinson in their paper on fiscal multipliers. And we get it from 1940 to 1945 from a couple of economic historians that have worked on it, so Andy Guerin and co. And then, but in order to fill in this gap, we have to go get new data. And so we go to these Department of Defense reports that has annual contracts that have the aggregate amount of annual contracts by state for the Army, Navy, and Air Force from 1951 to 1981. This is also used by Duper and Guerrero, an extension of Nakamura and Steinson. They find that you actually get very different multipliers, for example, when you add this extra data. And basically, and then from 1958 onwards, we're also then able to get this R&D and non-R&D share, and we kind of enter those in from congressional hearings and reports. And on the firm level stuff, basically we have the microdata from 1966 onwards, but what's published by the congressional reports is just kind of the top 100 military contractors in every year, and so we kind of work with that kind of top 100 military contractors and the amounts of their procurement. Okay, so some limitations of the procurement data. I'll go through this quickly. Basically, you're giving it to a company. How do you know where they're putting it? So it doesn't take into account subcontracting. But it's basically both anecdotally, and when you actually look at where the plants are, the large majority of the work is in the state. And that's why you wouldn't want to use a county, for example, because the county would just be the headquarters, but the plants would be all around. The other issue is that there's a time lag between when the contract is signed and the actual economic impact when it hits. And so we play with lags around taking averages over 2 years and things to sort of make sure that's not an issue. So there's also an interesting thing that like sometimes you get negative numbers because they'll have given money and then they'll like claw it back. Those of you that have ever done it, see this, and so we kind of sometimes have to allocate money kind of across years. So I think these are mostly concerns. These time concerns is like what is in the macro literature where you're really trying to get fiscal multipliers and getting year-on-year direct like impulse response functions. Because we're kind of interested in this like structural medium-run change caused by this, I think this is less of an issue, and you'll see why in just Other data that we use is a bunch of other state year level outcome data. So from the Handbook of Labor Statistics and BLS, we can get manufacturing employment and wages at the state year level. From historical unemployment insurance data, we can get the share of workers that are covered by UI, and we get the average wages. From the Bureau of Economic Analysis, we can get the federal income tax revenue, and from the World Income Database, we get state year level top 10 share, and also the share of filing a tax return at all. And then from Friedman and Malloy, we get executive salary data. They put together CEO data. And then our political data is going to come from harmonizing Gallup surveys. Okay, labor market effects of procurement shifts. How do we isolate procurement? So just for concerns around identification, we're going to kind of make the qualitative argument that we should think of a lot of this variation as in the particular states that are getting it as pretty much exogenous. So basically, the after World War II, particularly after the Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons, the U.S. sort of concludes that conventional warfare is not the priority. We need to focus on like air and nuclear supremacy. And so that kind of begins in the late 1940s, and then the Korean War kind of interrupts that by meaning we need more tanks. And then after the Korean armistice, they get back onto this like nuclear and missile arms race, and this is what gets called the New Look. And so the Soviets sort of test a number of bombs. And so there's this big fear of this missile gap. And so the money needs to go to putting in ICBMs and missile facilities. But it turns out there's not that many places in the U.S. where you can get a missile to Russia. And it turns out it's all these like mountain states that because you're sending them over Canada, you kind of need them to, and they're mountains, so they're defensible. And so you park a lot of money in the mountain states. And the one exception to that is Cape Canaveral in Florida, which is where you want to send missiles everywhere else in the world, because of where it sits relative to the equator and the winds. It's like that's the place to get missiles everywhere else, and the mountain states are where you want to get them for Russia. And so they have some sort of very key geographic advantages for this business of putting in missiles. And so this is, we like to show this as like, yep, we actually pulled this out of a book. And so this is our shock. So this is the World War II deliveries of aircraft. This is 1953. This is 61, so like you can see there's a decline a little bit in airplanes, but really where you see there's nothing happening in missiles, and then 33% of the spending is in missiles here, and so this is the shock that we're going to kind of exploit, and what's that coming expensive is that last thing, which is tanks, jeeps, weapons, ammo, production equipment, that stuff is going down. So it's basically a reallocation from these kind of basic blue-collar things towards towards like missile development. And so how do we do this? So partly to avoid some of these issues around fine-grained timing, we're just going to generate like a state-level cross-sectional variable that's like the missile shift. And what that is, that's like the procurement between 1954 and 1961, so post, like that's in the missile shift. So we add up all of that, and we divide it by your baseline GDP in 1950. So that's like the post variable, and then we difference that, the procurement that you were getting in 1951 to 1953 over the average GDP in 1950. And so we take the delta now, and we're trying to capture this like long difference of going from like the Korean War kind of production of tanks and jeeps to like the post-Korea transition to missiles and airplanes. And so this is kind of like going to be our main treatment variable. We can play around with this, and it doesn't really matter. It's levels versus logs. We can normalize it by different things. Nothing really matters here. And so this is kind of like the geographic variation, which is like this is then who are the winners and who are the losers. And so you can see these mountain states kind of are all the big winners. Here is the green, and then Florida. And those are the places getting money. And the places that are losing money is like the Rust Belt. It's basically, and it's not yet a Rust Belt. It's like this is during peak manufacturing employment, but the money is already getting moved out of Michigan and Ohio, which is like traditional industrial base, into these other states. And so what we're going to do is then kind of run a state year panel regression where we take that delta variable, that's like that pre-post long difference change, and we interact it with every single year. And then I'm going to show you event studies. I'm going to show you like coefficient plots from this thing. We should actually have the coefficients in there, but from that first term. And we can always control for region by year just to make sure that we're like not sort of getting this mechanical spillovers thing of comparing two places that are next to each other. And it turns out that as another sort of case for why this is not kind of a pure spillover story is that including like region by year or division by year, those coefficients don't look any different from when you don't have them. So it suggests that there's not something happening because of this these SEPA violations. So this is like the first stage. This is almost mechanical. So this is the change in procurement and the long difference interacted with each year. And so this on actual procurement. So this needs to just work by construction. And it pretty much does. So this is our, so we weight all these regressions by population, but it doesn't. So this is just like our first stage. And this is kind of our first main result. So this is log manufacturing employment per capita. Basically, you can kind of see that then, so this is the shift variable. And so it's telling you that the places that are gaining manufacturing employment at the expense of the places that are losing. And so this is like kind of the difference there. And so the applied elasticity here is about 0.06 of manufacturing employment per capita and procurement as a share of GDP. This is logged covered employment. So if you thought of like it's just share of employment, the amount of employment that's in like good jobs, sort of that are covered by the unemployment insurance system, you again get like a very similar coefficient here. And so just to do these in terms of in per capita terms, basically a 1 standard deviation increase in this like exposure to the missile shift leads to like about a loss of 7 manufacturing jobs per 1,000. And so, Michigan loses 40 manufacturing jobs per capita to between the pre-period to the post-period. And the coefficient on this missile shift thing predicts a 23 total workers' job losses per 1,000. those 57% of the total line in this period. And similarly, Arizona gains 9 jobs per capita over the same period, and the missile shift predicts almost all of them. And so we're getting a lot of what's going on. So inequality results, so there's a paucity of state year measures of inequality, like labor market kind of, we would love like a 90-10 ratio or something like that, but all we have is this top 10 share of income. And we all meant it was to share falling returns, but we can look at wages. In this period only, we also have some farm outcomes. I don't think I have them in these slides, but we've looked at farms per capita. So partly the question is like, where is this manufacturing employment coming from? Is it coming out of transitions from agriculture? Not really, or like we can't say that. Like the coefficients on farm was just too noisy to say. So this is what the results look like on top 10 share. So again, you're kind of, the coefficient on the shift variable, the places that are getting the money are sort of seeing inequality fall relative to the places that are losing the money, and the share filing returns is going up. So basically, both of these measures of inequality are falling in response to this missile shift. And then, so these are a little, there's more pre-trends here. So this is log manufacturing wages, and so this definitely looks like you might be worried about pre-trends, but I think what we can sort of conclude is there's no evidence of, like, the natural worry is that, okay, you're expanding the sector where you're getting like worse workers into it, and so like the marginal wage is falling, and so you could tell a story where you'd expect wages to fall, and you don't sort of see that in manufacturing wages. And if you look at the total covered sector of these good jobs, you sort of see wages going. So it looks overall like a labor demand shock. And just to complement this, we're also we look at these firm level outcomes. And so just as procurement shifted geographically, it also shifted from auto companies to aeronautic companies. So this is General Motors. And so this is like the share of the money in the top 100 that it's getting. And General Motors is getting an enormous amount of money for Jeeps and tanks from the Department of Defense. And it stays high. So this is World War II. Stays high through Korea, and then plummets after Korea. While General Dynamics, which is like basically a aerospace company that does high-tech stuff, it's got a much lower share here through Korea, but then gets kind of an enormous share. So this is this like cross-firm variation. So we're still trying to collect more firm-level data here. I think we're going to have to go back to their like 10 table filing to get them all. But what we're going to do for today is to create this firm-level procurement shift variable to examine, so it's very similar to the missile shift, to examine the relationship of contracts to executive pay relative to market cap. And so if you sort of think that there's a mechanical relationship between CEO pay and market cap, well, it's like when you get this additional revenue from Department of Defense, does it sort of change that relationship? In particular, like this. During World War II, you had a bunch of CEOs that were like proud to go. It's like Elon Musk. I only get $1 a day of CEO compensation. I'm doing this out of the patriotism. That was not true during the Cold War. Nobody said that. But the Congress basically regularly scrutinized. There was this concern about the military-industrial complex, and so CEOs were under a lot of scrutiny, and so there was kind of norms constraining executive pay. So this is like one of these, this is like basically where they publish the officers of the companies getting money from the Department of Defense in a congressional report. Because they're like, they kind of want to make sure that this money isn't getting directed to CEOs. And so this is what the event study looks like. So this, again, we can kind of construct the exact same specification except at the firm level. So we're, again, creating the shift variable at the firm level and interacting with time. And then we're looking at executive pay over total market cap and taking out firm fixed effects and industry by year fixed effects. And again, you kind of see this, missile shift variable having a negative effect on CEO pay relative to market cap after the end of the Korean. So that's sort of reassuring on the multiple margins of inequality getting reduced by the Cold War spending. Okay, so then that's our first shock. Okay, so I'll do Vietnam and then I'll skip to the draft. this missile period ends in the early 1960s. The CIA is sort of publishing those reports that we caught up, that we've now surpassed the Soviets in missiles, and Kennedy favored a flexible response that relied also on conventional forces, and then McNamara, probably because he's got like an econ kind of aesthetic, just sort of pushes budget cuts, particularly in R&D. And so, there's this pivot kind of away from the missile gap, but then what happens is Vietnam happens after the French are defeated in 1954. That's like the beginning of a slow escalation, and then it turns into like kind of a hot escalation after the Gulf of Tonkin. And this then turns Vietnam from like the slow escalation into a hot war, where you then need again all of this traditional ordnance, to the point that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, actually publishing this earlier, has a separate industry for ordnance, as like that's that's like the SIC code is ordnance. So it's like jeeps, helicopters, uniforms. Okay, so for this period, we can break things out into non-R&D and R&D. The problem is that there's not like a clear event, the same way that you'd think that there was in Korea. So this is kind of like where we're in the first missile period, and the blue line is the R&D spending, and then it kind of comes down, but then it kind of comes up again with the Vietnam mobilization, and then comes down. But that's the R&D spending. When you look at just the non-R&D spending, it stays low, and then the Vietnam mobilization kind of creates the effect. So it suggests that the thing to look at is to look at the non-R&D spending, kind of controlling for the R&D spending, and see if that big shift induced by Vietnam kind of like pushes our outcome variables. So what we're going to do instead of the event state, we're going to use the two-way fixed effects and kind of do this simultaneously, controlling for non-R&D and R&D, and look specifically at those two coefficients, and try to isolate that differential effect of the non-R&D spending relative to the R&D. And so this is just the aggregate procurement, not disentangling it. You get kind of the things that we sort of saw before on increases in manufacturing employment, reductions in top tier, increases in the share paying taxes, increases in covered employment, increases in the wage, not significant but positive effects on taxes. But when we break it out by non-R&D and R&D, you can see almost all of the effects are getting loaded up on the non-R&D spending. So it really suggests it's the non-R&D component of this procurement that's really going on. So that's the non-R&D as a share of flag GDP versus the R&D as a share. But basically, this has very small and generally insignificant effects, and almost all of the effects are kind of coming off of the non-R&D. So the procurement money that's doing the work is not the fancy stuff. It's the non-R&D stuff. Okay, I think I will get this. I don't. Okay, I'll do this sounds. So both Liliana and I are kind of big history geeks, so we just kind of like all this terminology of like SALT 1. Oh my God! It's so basically, even after Vietnam, right? So exiting Vietnam, there was all this treaty making between the U.S. and Soviet Union, and so there was like sort of this period of détente where it was like we're going to demobilize and try to conduct armed control agreements, and so sorry, I'm like laughing because I'm definitely like Ollana's second human. So like basically the idea that we're not going to prioritize this anti-communism stuff. We're just going to try to get livable arrangement with the Soviet. And so this SALT I treaty sort of caps the number of ICBMs. This ballistic missile treaty eases the fear of first strike attacks. And then these Helsinki Accords like thaw tensions. You see trade flows between the Soviets and the U.S. increase. But then when Carter comes into power in the U.S. side, and Brzezinski comes into power in the Soviet side, things go sort of south, and so there's détente is over by 1979. The Soviets invade Afghanistan. There's a failure of another round of anti-ballistic missile treaty. So then you see Carter starting this buildup, and then Reagan kind of just amplifies it. So basically, Anatoly Dobrin says Reagan turns out to be far worse and far more threatening than even Carter. But Carter was already kind of mobilizing a lot of resources into the military. And so this is, again, kind of our shift variable, again, looking like so we think of 79 as détente, and so we're, again, constructing the shift variable pre and post, and so we get this log procurement. And again, we can do R&D and non-R&D, and so this end of détente buildup is both in R&D and non-R&D. And so again, we can break it out and sort of look at which one's doing the work here. This is just the geographic variation. Somebody really needs to write a paper about the universities getting this money. It's like MIT. It's just like it is like up there with GM as like getting money from the DoD in this period. So this is the log manufacturing employment, and again, you kind of see the manufacturing employment is really responding to the non-R&D procurement and not the R&D procurement. And so it's again like and then when you kind of put it all in one big regression, you get, the significant coefficient is on the non-R&D spending and not the R&D stuff. Again, share filing returns, there's a positive effect of non-R&D procurement, nothing on the R&D procurement. And then covered employment, similarly, it's all on the non-R&D procurement and not on the R&D procurement. Interesting, this is the one shock that we have where inequality is not reduced by the shock, and we haven't figured out exactly why. We think it's probably because of the massive recession in this early 80s period. And so if you imagine the mechanism that is driving down the top 10 shares, something like a labor market tightening, and then that's just like not on the table in the 1980s, and that might be one thing. There's lots of things. Okay, I'm gonna skip the end of the full war. So the final thing we're gonna do is just to like pool 1951 to 2000 in a big pooled two-way fixed-effects regression. And so we're just going to put it all together in one regression. And this is kind of like the coefficients we get of like procurement share of lag GDP is 9%. Just like just trying to get elasticities. Like 9%, then taking 2 years averages, 0.1%, and then doing it in levels here, we get as a share of percentage GDP, we get these coefficients. And it all kind of like when you put it in the two-way fixed-effects, we're getting, there's not the weird composition thing. No. And sort of so again, pooling this, right, so that's about like that's like an elasticity of about 0.1. So if you look at the just time series regression, of share GDP of procurement on manufacturing share, you again get about like a 0.06, which is like pretty much in the ballpark of the 0.1, and actually very close. We get 0.08 and some other associations in the pooled one. And so it just makes us think that like there's like a ceiling on the amount of like crowd out that this is, and we wouldn't expect the time series on the inequality stuff to have any relationship to the state year inequality, because inequality top 10 share don't aggregate out the way that manufacturing employment does. Okay, so okay, great. So now I can talk about the draft. So the compulsory draft ends in 1973, and until then, basically millions of men are conscripted to active duty, even in peacetime. And so from 1947 to 1972, those large shares of young men in active duty at any given moment. So it's like 2% of ages 16 to 17, super young men, are like drafted into the army, and then 20% of men under the age of 25, and then it follows, So basically, this is, again, still work in progress. We're like regularly go to the National Archives and are trying to find like state year measures of the active duty people from that state that are on active duty. We're sure it exists somewhere in the bowels of like Pentagon archives. We just haven't found it yet. And it's, by the way, just like for graduate students, just like going around and spelunking in archives for data sets, it's a gift that never stops giving. It's just like there's lots of stuff that you'll just never think that would be out there, and there's some that's in my boat. But you have to go looking. And it's the one thing that like a robot will not be able to do for you is to hunt around in the backpack. Yes. Okay, so and our specification here then is now, because we don't have the state level variation, we're going to use cohort level variation. So basically, we're going to model unemployment by age group year as a function of active duty risk. So unemployment as a function of share at risk of is the active duty share in that age group multiplied by the total number of people that are on active duty. So there's basically going to be fluctuations in the military demand for people, and then that's going to expose over time, and that's going to hit different age cohorts differently depending on their age. And then we're going to have and we're going to control for cohort fixed effects and time fixed effects. And we can look at female unemployment as a placebo, just to, they're not getting drafted. But, and this is kind of like our identifying variation here, is that this is the active duty share of the population, and you can kind of see the big ramp up with the Korean War, and then it ramps down, but still stays fairly high, ramps up during Vietnam, and then falls, and then the drought is abolished. And so this is by cohort, so this is, I think, the cleanest thing that shows what's going on. So you have the active duty share was the blue line. So look at the blue line. And then you have the average unemployment. You have the workers that are like draftable, the 18 to 24 is the red line. And then you kind of have the average employment in all the other ages that are not draftable. And basically, the gap kind of between the young workers and all the other workers shrinks exactly in the periods where the active duty employment is very high. And these are young workers, the least attached to the labor market. They generally have higher unemployment rates, but that gap vis-a-vis older workers just really shrinks in these periods of high mobilization for war. And again, so if you just put this in a regression, you kind of get what you'd expect. So this is the effects on age group specific unemployment rates from that specification I showed you. And so when you do it in levels, it's like -5. So it's all standardized. So I wouldn't interpret the coefficients on the fly. Then you should do it in logs. And then you can look at women as a placebo. There's no effects on women. And you can kind of do it even just rather than using age-based risk, you can just use specifically at the 18 to 24-year-olds. And then instead of using the active duty share, you can just use the years that there's actually a war going. And it kind of all goes through. And so to assess the magnitudes here, we can extrapolate these effects to explain the rise in a young male unemployment rate. And so if you think of, it's that basically with the elimination of the draft, the unemployment rate rises from 4.2 to 6.6% 10 years after the draft. And so we can explain about 79% of that rise with kind of the elimination of the drafts. So this is just doing that counterfactual. Okay, so then the last thing I'll do, because none of you have asked questions, so it's just sort of spooky. Okay, so is to talk about the political economy of this. And so today we just got the 1950s, 1960s, and we're still digitizing it. And the question we're after, though, is did procurement spending create these pro-war constituencies? And in particular, we can use this like state year level shock to look at support for specific conflicts and support for military spending. And then we're going to look at this again cross countries and sort of say, is the constituency that's responding to military procurement in the U.S., what does that constituency look like in like other NATO allies? And I'll show you. So this is just to get a regression table out of the way. It's like support Korea at the individual state level on state level procurement. It's just like the more money you get from procurement, the more likely you are to support the Korean War. And then what you kind of get is that that's not there in 1950. So this is totally this is support in 1950 on 1951 to 1953 procurement. That's like, if anything, downward sloping. But then during the Korean War, the places that get the money are kind of really get excited about the war, so that we're hoping to just do this for like Vietnam and as many of the other conflicts that we can get, like this kind of get this effective procurement on support for the Korean War. And we also get this, we have this sort of similar results on support more military spending as well. And then what's interesting is also you can look at the households that are doing this supporting, and at some point we need to interact this with the procurement shot. But basically it's like union households are more likely to support the war, more likely to support military spending. People who self-identify as Democrat are more likely to support the war, more likely to favor military spending. So that's like the blue collar base of the Democratic Party is kind of supporting both the war and military spending. And then we can look at this and see like basically the other people that are like supporters of like social democratic parties in other countries than Canada, France, or the UK. And in all of those countries, the people that are like central left partisans are like opposed to hawkish foreign policy, to aggression vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It's only in the U.S. that you have that the supporters of the central left supporters are also supporters of hawkish military policy. And we think that the giant amounts of money flowing into the U.S. economy as a result of this is probably as something to do with that. So I'll conclude there. So, this is very much work in progress, but, we've tried to isolate these shifts in military priorities and show that defense spending boosted manufacturing employment and reduced inequality during the peak years of the Cold War. Basically, this decline in procurement spending can explain about 14 to 30% of the decline in manufacturing employment and about 9 to 16% of the rise in top 10 share. Firms receiving more procurement saw CEO pay to market cap fall. And the state year results are quantitatively similar to the aggregate time series results, suggesting this is not just a crowd-out story. We also show the military drafts significantly lowered unemployment for young workers. And then the last part was showing that support to the Korean War increased with local procurement, suggesting this was like a self-sustaining political coalition. Here, and kind of putting all of this together, we just think this like military Keynesianism during the Cold War was a big deal in maintaining this like golden age of U.S. thought. And that's it.